Any further calls? The question is that the report on the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the annual financial statements of the Government for the year endeth 30th of June 2010 and Treasury be noted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. You're seeking a party vote? The clerk will conduct a party vote. Well, it's...
Mr Speaker, we are relaxed about seeking a party vote.
Yeah, okay. So the ayes have it. Thank you. I understand the next financial review members wish to debate is the financial review of the Ministry of Economic Development. Will members please turn to the Commerce Committee's report? And the question is that the Commerce Committee on the 2009-10 financial review of the Ministry of Economic Development be noted. Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, I struggle to see why we should approve any funding for this minister for the Ministry of Economic Development. And I know that's a little bit harsh, and actually I don't really believe that, because there is some machinery of government work that the Ministry of Economic Development has to continue to do. But why we should give the minister more money for the support that he receives in his office from the Ministry of Economic Development, or some of the other things that are funded through this budget, I cannot see. We had a party, the National Party, who, when they came to office, said that they were going to lead New Zealand to a brighter future. Do you remember that? A brighter future. And their key to a brighter future was that they were going to develop the New Zealand economy so that the New Zealand economy was more profitable. And one of the things they kept saying to us was, look, we're going to bridge the wage gap with Australia. What's happened since? Has the wage gap grown, or has it decreased? It's gone up. It's gone up a lot. The wage gap with Australia continues to grow, and of course the Minister of Economic Development during the year under financial review was asked about that in Parliament, and he turned up and was asked that question as to whether the wage gap with Australia has gone up or gone down, and he got the answer wrong. He didn't even know. He didn't even know. And so then the big spin machine came out of the National Party, and the Prime Minister came down the next day and tried to manipulate the figures to use some purchase price parity figures adjusted for purchase price parity, and say that on that basis the wage gap had narrowed. But of course, when we looked at that, the Prime Minister was wrong too. And at the time, TV3 accused the Prime Minister of being too slippery by half. And they used the words being too slippery. So, Mr Chairman, on that measure, we've, as a consequence of that, been trying to get the Minister of Economic Development to at least say, well, if this is your objective by 2025, by which time many members of this Parliament will sadly be dead, most of the sitting members will have retired, and no one from the National Party will be accountable for the promise that they made, we've said, well, given that that's a meaningless promise and you don't even know where you're getting to halfway through, give us some milestones. Give us something by which you will be held accountable. Could you at least say, will you agree that if by the next election the gap's still getting wider, you will have failed? They wouldn't accept that as a target. So we said, how about promising that you'll get it back to where it was when you started into office? They wouldn't even agree to that. So we haven't been able to get any milestone by which they will be held accountable. So what other promises were they making at the time? They said that they were going to cause a step change in the New Zealand economy. Another of their promises, a step change in the New Zealand economy. Well, I can't see any line item in the budget that says whatever it is to get towards our step change in the New Zealand economy, because they've given up on that lingo too. That's dropped out of their lexicon. We no longer hear them talking about a step change in the New Zealand economy. I was really embarrassed at the other failure in the national government to do what they promised on curbing the flow of people to Australia. Why was I embarrassed? Because actually I'm a member of Parliament who thinks that we shouldn't make promises to the electorate that we're not going to keep. And another of their promises was that they were going to stop this great flow of people from New Zealand to Australia. Well, what's happened? Last year it was the highest in the last decade but once. Second highest figures except for one other year in a decade. So much so that when Julia Gillard was here recently, she said that she liked having New Zealand as a provider of talented, well-educated people as a source of labour to make their economy grow. We are losing too many of our best, well-educated, productive people to Australia. Now, what's the Minister of Economic Development doing in response? Well, the answer is very little. We had, during this year under review, the failed attempt to mine national parks. They said the big difference between New Zealand and Australia was mining, and that they were going to mine New Zealand's national parks and other Schedule 4 areas. There was an outcry against that, as there ought to have been, partly because they were exaggerating what difference it would make, and partly because it was just wrong on principle. And in the end, in the face of public protests, the national government backed down on that, but they didn't replace it with a new policy. So here we come to their third budget, and we're told by Mr Bennett, one of the members for the Hamilton area, that the big thing in the budget will be savings. They're finally admitting, after 2.5 years in power, that one of the big differences between the New Zealand economy... Mr Chairman.
You're seeking a second call?
I am,
Honourable
Mr
David
Chairman.
Parker.
One of the big differences between the New Zealand economy and the Australian economy is their depth of savings, and therefore the investment capital available to their enterprises to invest in more productive equipment and improve the productivity and competitiveness of their economy. Well, hello, that's been obvious for a number of years in the New Zealand economy, and that the government didn't have a plan in that regard after 9 years in opposition is lamentable. It's absolutely lamentable. Indeed, everything that they have done in respect of savings since then has been wrong. When we were in government, we ran budget surpluses. That's public savings. Public savings. And when we were in government, we introduced the KiwiSaver scheme to encourage private savings. What did the national government do? They undermined it. The third thing that we did whilst in government was, of course, establish what's known as the Cullen Fund to, through public savings, help pre-fund superannuation, and by doing so also increase the depth of our savings and investment in New Zealand. To after 2.5 years say that the focus of the next budget in terms of economic development will be savings is a sad indictment on the lack of a plan on the part of the national government. They have obviously got an inadequate plan, so much so that the New Zealand Institute at the end of last year produced a report which I thought was a very clever flick at the government, which said a target is not a strategy, or a goal is not a strategy. I think the term might have been, a goal is not a strategy. I think that might have been reference to their 2025 goal of bridging the wage gap with Australia, but having no strategy or accountability for milestones in the meantime. Then Mr Brownlee's had to go away and perform duties in Christchurch post-earthquake, and good on him for doing that, and I wish him well in those efforts. And we've got the acting minister in the chair, and we ask him what his plan is to lift us out of the economic malaise that New Zealand is in, a second recession, Nationals recession. Over half of the latest re-estimations of government revenues and economic growth caused by factors other than the earthquake, and yet they say that's the cause of all their problems. And yet we haven't heard from the new acting minister one new idea, not one. Rising unemployment, bigger gaps with Australia, dropping tax revenue. The only way we're going to get out of this mess, Mr Chairman and Mr Minister in the chair, the only way we're going to get out that is through improved economic growth. Bomb cases, as other commentators have described them, like the United States and the United Kingdom, are bouncing out of recession. And what's New Zealand happening? We're heading into a second recession. The economic malaise continues, and we have no alternative vision, no vision for growth being shown in New Zealand. Instead, we have the government saying it's all the fault of the earthquake. Of course, the earthquake has made New Zealand's problems worse, but it is not the underlying cause of the malaise. The underlying cause of the malaise, of the low jobs growth, of the low economic growth, is mismanagement by the national government.
Mr. Chairman.